Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it's time to take some of your questions, and our first question this week comes from Josh on the Patreon, and Josh asks, what do you make of the Canada Disability Act, Bill C-22? I'm confused about what has really been passed. Will the House of Commons have to vote again when they decide on funding levels, and how might this work with or conflict with provincial action on disability benefits? Understandable that you're kind of confused because this is actually fairly complicated. So what Bill C-22 was what we call framework legislation. And so it kind of lays out the broad legislative framework by which this benefit's going to flow, but all the actual details are going to happen on the regulatory side. So now that the bill has passed and has received royal assent, now the regulatory work can begin. And that's where they fill in all of the rules around what the benefit's going to be, what the funding levels are, all that kind of stuff. And that happens in a separate process. And there is a whole regulatory process for any regulation that flows out of any piece of legislation. And that involves a certain level of publishing draft regulations, getting stakeholder feedback, and then publishing the final regulations in the Canada Gazette. So that's a whole process that exists, and this is what's going to happen with this bill now. But there's also a negotiation aspect around this with the provinces because most disability benefits are from provincial jurisdiction, and what this bill or what this benefit purports to do is use the federal taxation mechanism to provide some level of benefit for people with disabilities so that they can be lifted out of poverty. Part of that negotiation is going to be around things like clawbacks. And we have certain provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan most especially, who absolutely love to claw back any federal monies from their own provincial benefits, which is one of those kind of perverse things which, again, just legislates poverty and keeps people with disabilities in, poor living standards and income levels. So this is one of the things that the minister has been trying to do with the provinces, is trying to negotiate in order to ensure that these clawbacks don't happen and that people who receive this benefit aren't being unduly penalized by the provincial systems. I don't know the status of those negotiations other than that they've been going on for a couple of years now, as this bill has taken a long time through the legislative process, and that's for various reasons. But that's kind of where the state of that is at. Once the regulations are developed and published, they don't need to be voted on again by the House of Commons. That's actually one of the things about regulation, is that it's much more nimble and much more easy to adapt to circumstances than legislation is. And that's, the legislative process can be long in some particular circumstances. And so by having a regulatory process for that, it's going to be faster. And if situations change and the need to adjust the rules or adjust the funding levels or whatever, as they, work out the kinks in this particular system as it develops over the first few years, that's one of the benefits of having the bulk of the rules through the regulatory mechanism, is that it's much more adaptable and much more responsive in that regard. So that's kind of what's happening with that legislation now. I don't anticipate we're going to start seeing the benefits roll out for probably at least 9 months, maybe a year, because this is going to be a complicated process on the regulatory side and ensuring that they're reaching the right, I don't want to say balance, but the right rules and structures in terms of ensuring that this benefit flows to those who need it, and that the funding levels are adequate and so on. So that's kind of where that's at. People who've been waiting for this need to be patient for a little while longer, but it is getting there. Yeah, that's kind of where it's at. Our other question tonight comes from Steve Shaw on Twitter, who asks, would the House of Commons improve if members sat in alphabetical order rather than by party? And my partially smartass answer there is that there is a certain level of alphabetical arrangement to, at least on the Liberal benches, how their MPs are organized. Usually it's by year you were elected and then alphabetical within that year. So there is a certain level of that. But this notion that if we didn't group MPs by parties and just made everyone alphabetical, that it would somehow improve decorum, has been floated around for a while, but I don't know that it would actually necessarily improve things, because the theory is that by everyone sitting in teams that they kind of goad one another on, and then if you're sitting with people from opposite teams, then you're going to be less likely to heckle or make noise. But part of the issue here is that Westminster democracies are by nature oppositional. There is a government and a loyal opposition for a reason, and by having them face off, it provides, it does sort of provide for the accountability mechanism that you have an ability to square off, debate, challenge, look one another in the eye over these kinds of, the questions you're asking and so on. Where you wouldn't necessarily have that if the leader of the opposition is sitting behind and 3 rows back from the prime minister, assuming even that we would still have a front bench, which kind of makes a certain level of organizational sense and for ease of being able to find people, and so on there. But again, and then you also have the other issue of, if you're sitting alphabetically with opposing parties side by side, if you've got a backbencher next to a minister who's got a briefing book in front of them, I don't know that necessarily works very well in terms of, having a certain level of secrecy or privacy or something around confidential materials that ministers have to assist them during debates or question period. So there's that kind of just kind of functional level there as well. But again, part of the problem here is that the problems we're seeing are not really because they're goading one another on. It's because they're doing things for the sake of performance. Question period is very performative. It is, and its purpose is very much theater, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because your biggest danger the other hours of the day in the House of Commons is narcolepsy, because people reading speeches into the record for 8 hours of that day doesn't really make for much sense. Also to organize yourselves in that particular way. But yeah, so part of the issue is performance, and it's not just the performance of the back and forth. It's also these days performing for the cameras. I don't see how that behavior would change if you're, no matter where they're sitting, because that's kind of, it's baked into the notion that if you're performing for the cameras, then you're not doing this as kind of the team sport so much. Although, the fact that you'd have people still trying to fill camera shots and so on could be even more awkward if you're mixing parties in there as well. But again, like I've been saying, the underlying causes for what people are reacting to it's not seating arrangements. It's not because you're sitting in teams. It's because there's a performative element to it. And frankly, we would actually, I think, lose something if we lost all of that. I'm not going to say that everything is hunky-dory right now, because it's really not. There's a lot of problems with what's going on. But again, that's not a structural problem so much as it is an incentives issue. And the incentives don't change no matter where they're sitting. So that's what I would say in response to that. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.